She's 82 years old, but is firing on all cylinders. Still crazy after all these years, as Paul Simon sang. Well, crazy enough to still believe the world can be changed for the better, and that it's her duty to try make that happen. This is the Bureau of Lost Culture. I'm Stephen, and this is the story of Nancy KURSHAN. Nancy grew up in a radical family, got involved very early in the civil rights movement and the anti-Vietnam War protests, became one of the founders of the Yippies, the theatrical protest group whose activities included levitating the Pentagon and all sorts of other shenanigans. She travelled to North Vietnam with a women-only group during the war, and she became involved with the Weather Underground, another previously militant radical countercultural group. And then she became involved for 15 years in prison reform, worked in social work and youth education, meanwhile having kids, and she hasn't stopped since. But before we hear all about that, thanks to those who've joined our Patreon and helped support this wild endeavour, and to those who've written with appreciation. I won't mention his name, but somebody wrote this week saying, well, he couldn't afford to contribute financially at the moment, which I get. He wanted to offer any help we might need. We really appreciate that. Join us, bureauoflostculture.com. Now, on with the show. This is a conversation with someone who's been totally committed to countercultural activism, social change and radical politics, and has managed to remain optimistic and be very good fun. Let's do it. Nancy, I want to welcome you to the Bureau of Lost Culture.
Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here.
Nancy, you've led a long life in activism. You're still at it. And interestingly, you are one of those people who has been called sometimes a lifer, somebody whose commitment survived long after the headlines have faded. Unlike some of the people you're very, very intimately connected with, you didn't become a kind of celebrity activist, did you?
No. And by the way, a lifer here sometimes refers to someone who has a life sentence in prison. But hopefully I'm not that.
No, you've been sentenced to a whole lifetime of doing good. How about that?
Thanks.
Why don't we start at the beginning, though? Because you were born in 1944 in Brooklyn. You were actually born into a family of activists in a way. You call it a red diaper family. Tell us what a red diaper family is or was.
Okay, a red diaper family or a red nappy family would be one where the parents of the baby were either were members of the Communist Party USA, in my case, or were what we called fellow travelers, which were people who were sympathetic to the cause, or were part of some other radical group. I mean, there were Trotskyites or Trotskyists, depending on your ideological viewpoint.
So your parents were Trotskyists, were they?
No, my parents weren't. My mother was Communist Party. But I had friends whose parents were Trotskyists.
I wasn't very aware that there was a Communist Party of America. In fact, there may still be one. I think because of the Cold War and, the whole Red Scare thing, Reds under the bed, the anti-communist rhetoric, is that I suppose in a way we would just assume that there never was such a thing, but there was, right? And your mum was part of it.
Yeah, in my mother's generation, it was actually pretty huge. I don't know.
Right.
Can't recall the number, but it was very big. And Soviet Union was an ally of the United States in World War II. But then, of course, the whole thing flipped after the war. And 2 people were executed in the United States, the Rosenbergs, Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, for being communists, basically. And
was that the actual reason given? I mean, or was it some other, offense?
They were accused of being Soviet spies. But the Soviets, like I said, were our allies during the war. And then there's been a lot of conversation about were they actually or weren't they? And many people believe now that Morton Sobel maybe was, but what does it mean that he was a spy? I don't know. His wife, it's thought, wasn't. And they executed both of them.
Let's talk a little bit about the anti-communist repression in America as well, whether your mother got impacted by that, because that was a whole thing too, wasn't it, with McCarthyism? We were actually sort of hunting down people who had those sympathies and making their life kind of impossible, right?
Right. My mother was kind of brave, I think. And my father refused to sign a loyalty oath connected to his business. I don't think he was in the party even, but he didn't believe that people should have to sign loyalty oaths. You know, my mother campaigned on the side of the Republicans in the Spanish Civil War against fascism before World War II, and spent a night in jail as a teenager for raising money for the Republican side of the Civil War. You know, had friend who was in something called the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, which were Americans who went to fight in Spain against the fascists. But that was before my time. She said to me, the difference between her and me was she was part of the political action because she felt responsible. She was a poor working class woman. She felt she had to do that and she said, you seem to enjoy being a political activist.
You think there's a distinction there between like feeling impelled to do it and choosing to do it?
Yeah, I kind of feel both, I think. She didn't enjoy it. She didn't get as much meaning out of it, I guess, as I did.
Do you think there's the politics, but also the sense of being an activist, whether it's a desire or the choice to actually do something, is something that you just kind of imbibed in the atmosphere of your childhood?
Yeah, I inherited it. I mean, they sent me to a summer camp for 7 years where most of the kids there came from families like mine, which had a very big impact on me. Pete Seeger came every summer and sang to us, and shortly before he was called to appear before the House Un-American Activities Committee that was leading this anti-communist Red Scare thing, and he was going to refuse to testify. He sang this song called Abbie, which is about a giant, and he would say at the end, you know, you can defeat a giant if you just keep on singing, and I intend to keep on singing, something like that. So all those things really did have a big impact on me. I'm grateful for it because, I mean, for me, it's morphed into lots of different things, but the basic moral compass of it all, I definitely inherited from my mother, who also, by the way, took me on the March on Washington where Martin Luther King spoke. But, you know, and she was already older, but she went and she protested against the war in Vietnam. You know, she was great.
Well, you were born in 1944, right? So when 1960 comes, where you've got the Beats who were sort of dealing with literature and poetry, and then this kind of nascent civil rights crossover with the sort of new folk tradition, right? So you're getting these singers who are sort of passionately inspired to sing songs and inspire other people about these issues.
Right. I mean, a lot of the folk songs that I learned at Camp Woodland were political, actually, when I think about them. They were anti-war for sure.
As a sort of teen, you were going into Greenwich Village in Manhattan, were you, and hanging out with the folkies and the Beats?
I was a wannabe Beat, I think. I had long hair and I refused to wear makeup. I probably gave my mother a heart attack. I didn't like to go shopping or anything. And I used to go to Greenwich Village when I was in high school the last few years and brought my guitar and hung out in Washington Square Park and played music. And people like Bob Dylan came along and sang Blowin' in the Wind, you know, which was very political. Then later Phil Oakes and all those kinds of people who sang beautiful songs and also very political.
Joan Baez?
She was one of my heroines.
Did you see that recent biopic about Dylan's early years?
I actually loved it because so many things were familiar looking and sounding.
I think it really evoked that time. I mean, obviously he infamously sort of moved on, didn't he? And people like Seeger and Joan Baez felt that Dylan had, in some ways, had sort of betrayed the movement because they definitely saw it as this is music in the service of something greater than entertainment, sung to change hearts, change minds, and inspire change.
Yeah, although Phil Oakes was totally involved with the Yippies, but he also just wrote very beautiful songs, other songs, love songs, other songs. But yes, they wanted to be an influence and a part of that.
But what happened next?
In high school, I joined the Committee for a Sane Nuclear Policy, and I helped to organize other young people in my high school around that, and we went to demonstrations in New York City, and I also joined civil rights picket lines the Congress on Racial Equality organized, which was a civil rights organization. And I helped organize a bus to Washington, D.C. for a similar demonstration. So I was already pretty political before I hit college. But then I went to Madison, Wisconsin, and there was a lot of political activity there, University of Wisconsin. First, I was in Americans for Democratic Action, and I campaigned for a progressive congressperson. I went to the first demonstration in D.C. Against the war in Vietnam that the Students for a Democratic Society organized. And I heard a speech there by Paul Potter, who was a leader of it, who basically was calling for us to, not just come to one demonstration, but to think about orienting our lives in this direction. And I was very impacted by it.
Did you manage to have some fun as well?
I did. I don't think I slept very much, and I don't think I studied very much. I did study, but I studied mostly the night or two before, and I took Ritalin. It's
Right.
a little bit of speed. Probably wasn't so great, but yeah, I don't know. I was involved. There was a sit-in at a store, a department store.
Was the reaction to it quite immediate then? Sort of 63 or something, wasn't it? I think it actually started.
Something like that, but in the beginning, it was a quiet war, and then it heated up more. And then I remember the first things I noticed were front page stories in the Madison, Wisconsin Student Union about some kind of bombing things in Vietnam. And I didn't know where Vietnam was.
Right.
I never heard of it. Some people there did, who were older than me and more involved in world affairs, I guess, and they started holding teach-ins and stuff. And I was resistant at first to really throw myself into it because I felt like I had been a part of these actions around civil rights, and I was afraid that if people were diverted into this stuff about a war I'd never heard of, that it would undermine the civil rights movement, because people would get distracted. And
you mean sort of divert people's energy from that, which was very much an American issue, wasn't it? On home territory, on home turf. It was the thing which affected Americans, Black Americans. The Vietnam War was one which was taking place in this distant country, which most people, probably to this day, still couldn't put a pin in the map to tell you where Vietnam is, right?
When they started drafting people figured out where it was, if they were going to go there. I think the draft did have a big impact, but it went beyond people who were being drafted. I mean, tons of women were in the anti-war movement too. They won me over fairly quickly. I was a supporter, but I wasn't super active in anti-war stuff. I was much more active in civil rights until I went to graduate school.
You went to do a PhD in psychology at Berkeley, right?
Yeah. I really wanted to go to Berkeley, to the University of California, Berkeley, because I had been watching the free speech movement from afar. And Mario Savio, the leader of it, calling for us to throw our bodies on the wheels.
Free speech movement. Just tell us a little bit about that.
I think it was probably people who were involved in the civil rights movement who were setting up tables and having conversations on the campus about politics, especially civil rights, also then the Vietnam War. And the university was sort of cracking down on them. And so there was like a student rebellion where they took over Sproul Hall. And a lot of people were arrested. And so it had a very big impact on the movement in general. And I saw a movie about the Bay Area at a House Un-American Activities event in the city of San Francisco. People were protesting and they opened up hoses on them and stuff. But the people were very resistant. And I thought, wow, that's a place where I want to be. The movie that I saw was a movie about HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee, but it was put together by the right, not us. And yet when they showed it in Madison to a movie theater, everybody was screaming and yelling and clapping and booing and was on the side of the demonstrators. It was quite an exciting event.
At Berkeley, you're protesting, you're very much an activist, but this is where you meet Jerry Rubin. And tell us about that. Who was he and where did you meet?
He was the leader of the Vietnam Day Committee, which was the big anti-war committee in Berkeley. Both students and non-students were in it. He was from Cincinnati, Ohio, where he was a reporter, so he's a journalist. But then he went on a trip with a group called Fair Play for Cuba to Cuba, and he met Che Guevara, although everyone there thought he was an agent because he was very straight-looking and he had a pad and he kept writing things down. And he came back and he was really involved in the Vietnam War movement when I met him. And there'd already been several huge teach-ins which involved not just political figures, but cultural figures who spoke and sang and all kinds of things. And then there were marches on the Oakland Army Terminal. And I was there for I think the last one. But I met Jerry and we were friends for about a year. And then after that, we started living together.
He became a kind of countercultural icon, didn't he? I mean, one of those people I mentioned earlier, kind of countercultural celebrity in a way, right? What was he like sort of personally?
When I met him, I really liked him, although I was in another relationship, but we were friends. He was a very generous person in a lot of ways. He introduced me to certain friends who were kind of nerdy, but he didn't care if those friends were popular or not. He was lovely. And he was very smart. Later, I had more issues with him.
It was a romance, right? It was a sort of slow-burning romance. It wasn't just like a kind of meeting of ideological minds.
I was on slow burner too, but like I said, I was in this other relationship, and I was really in love with this other person. But anyway.
It was the 60s, so I don't know how much this impacted you anyway, but there's a whole thing about free love, not being attached to one person.
Right.
Insisting on fidelity was because you were uptight. How did you surf that personally?
I think I was pretty traditional. I didn't believe you had to wait to get married to have sex or anything like that. I had lots of different boyfriends, but not at the same time. I guess I just had a tendency to be, I guess it's monogamous, sequential monogamy.
It was enough meeting him that you decided to drop out of academia, right, and dedicate yourself full-time to this escalating peace movement.
I mean, it took 2 years. I finished all my coursework first, but it was the call of moving to New York to help build the anti-war movement nationally. And Jerry was going to go, and I also wanted to go. I had a mixed relationship with the psych department. So I think they probably were happy that I left.
Why was it the peace movement, the anti-war movement, based more in New York than on the West Coast? Because you sort of associate these times really more with the West Coast, right?
I think the West Coast was very active, but it was largely a student movement. And in New York, it was going to be a national mobilization that was going to take place in Washington, D.C. So it was going to be at the site of the power. And so that's what attracted us. But when we were still in Berkeley, Jerry and I and some people in the Students for a Democratic Society, we organized a Black Power Day in which we invited Stokely Carmichael. Malcolm X was long before assassinated, but we invited all these Black Power leaders to come to the Greek Theater, which holds thousands of people, and we raised money for the Black Panthers. It's a little piece of history that is forgotten, that as white people mostly, probably all of us, we already understood like the power of Black nationalism, or at least wanted to know more.
So a lot of those groups at the time felt like they were allies. The specific cause might be different, but in some way you were generally allied, kind of on the same side in some way. So for you, even though maybe your focus was the anti-war movement, what was going on with Black Power, which tied into civil rights as well, I suppose. So that was something that actually you also wanted to support them in what they were trying to do.
Exactly.
moving to New York, we're talking about late 60s now, right? So what was New York and where were you living? And
It was 67, and we moved into the Lower East Side, which was very exciting. There was this burgeoning countercultural movement happening. I mean, it was happening in California too. In fact, before we left, we had met with people who were organizing the first Be-In in Golden Gate Park, and they invited Jerry to come and speak there, which was interesting. Everyone was partying, and there were all these great bands there, and who knows what. And then when we moved to New York, he moved before me because, as was not uncommon in that day, I did all the work of the move. I stayed back in California and organized our stuff and closed down our house. And then he called me from New York and said, I met this great guy, Abbie Hoffman, and we went and we burned money at the stock exchange, and it was it was great news. And he's really excited.
let's talk about the Hoffmans a little bit, because for anybody who doesn't know, who was Abbie Hoffman and Anita? What were they up to?
Well, Abbie, although he was hysterically funny, he was also very serious, as I think we all were. You can chew and walk at the same time. But he had been in the South, part of the civil rights movement, and he came back north and he set up something called Liberty House, which was an outlet for mostly Black women who were producing crafts in the South, and then he would sell them and send the proceeds back. When we formed the Yippies, he transferred the stewardship of that project to somebody else, and he became a full-time organizer like Jerry was.
There's this kind of chemistry between them. What do you think it was?
They were incredibly attracted to each other, and also maybe competitive with each other.
Was it a bromance?
I don't know about the sexuality part at all, but they really did mesh well, and they really did create a lot of great energy and plans. I mean, we all contributed.
There's you and Jerry, there's Abbie and Anita Hoffman, and then there's also Paul Krasner.
Right.
It's New Year's Eve, 1967, and you're in your apartment in the Lower East Side, East Village as it's now called, right? So just set the scene for us. What was the apartment like, and what were you guys up to, and what happened?
It was a ground floor apartment. I call it underfurnished. In the little living room that was the front room, it was just a bunch of pillows, basically, and we were sitting around them. And then there was a bedroom, which had one of those raised beds that Abbie had built, and that was about it. And what we came east to do, which was to organize a demonstration at the Pentagon, and 800 of us had been arrested there. So it was like, how are we going to continue this? Because we had done it all as part of the national mobilization to end the war in Vietnam, but there was a lot of tension with us and some other people, not all of them, because, we were part of the counterculture and we wanted to do something different. At the Democratic Convention that was coming up in August in Chicago, so we decided to do this thing called the Youth International Party, but then somebody said, let's call it Yippie. That became what it was. And it wasn't a card-carrying party, and anybody could be in it who wanted to be in it and do whatever they wanted. I don't know if you could do that today.
I mean, it's a bit of a silly name, isn't it? It sounds funny, doesn't it, Yippie? Because it's a little bit like hippie. And then, of course, later on in the 80s, I don't know about in the US, but we got these people called Yippies, which was like young, upwardly mobile or something.
Yes, urban professionals. Yeah,
young urban professionals. Yeah, young, upwardly mobile was yummies, which was even stranger sort of word, wasn't it?
I don't know them.
The thing about the Yippies, which it's a really appropriate name in a way, because it's got a kind of comic aspect.
Yippee!
Exactly, yippee. What's really apparent is there was a combination of sort of very passionately held beliefs and values and desire to bring about change, allied with a kind of comic, surrealist, disruptive, jokerish, or tricksterish, I suppose is probably the best word.
Yeah.
Wasn't it a combination of the two things, right? And was that there from the beginning? And was that to do with the personalities involved? And
Yes. I mean, burning money at the stock exchange and throwing it down. First, they threw it down and watched people scramble. And Abbie, of course, was very funny, actually. He could have been a stand-up comedian, I think. So it was also a strategic thing. I may have mentioned people were reading Marshall McLuhan, The Media is the Message, and television was clearly the media of our generation at that point. And we wanted to figure out ways to reach people through it. And we knew that theatricality, satire, that kind of thing would be effective in doing that. And but it wasn't a traditional tools that the anti-war movement was using, but we wanted to do more of that.
You've got the straight political left, haven't you? The kind of the literary intellectual left, if you like, who are kind of quite dour, I suppose, is probably the best word to describe, the kind of Trotskyists. And then you've got the kind of smoking dropout hippie counterculture. I mean, of course, you've got trickster types as well, like Ken Kesey, but somehow you sort of managed to bridge this cultural divide between these different groups of the counterculture.
Right. Well, I think we did a pretty good job, actually. Oh, by the way, we would say Yippies were hippies who had been hit over the head by a policeman's club.
Right. You've been radicalized in some way, right? But also an important part of the counterculture was performance art, wasn't it? Theater.
Right. When we were in California, Jerry was called to the House Un-American Activities Committee. Ronnie Davis, who just died a couple of weeks ago, a founder of the San Francisco Meme Troupe, which was this fabulous group. It still exists. That they used to do just theater on the streets, and then they did political theater, and it was funny and bright. And he told Jerry, when they call you to the House Un-American Activities Committee, go wearing an American Revolutionary War outfit, tri-corner hat, whole thing. He wanted to testify, but they wouldn't let him. They knew it would go out all over the United States in the media that he was dressed as an American revolutionary.
Which is quite significant, isn't it? Because you just had the 250th anniversary of the founding of the Union, right? When you guys split off from us after the revolution. And so, in a way, somebody dressed like that is reclaiming, if you like, possession of the kind of original American free spirit. So it's, as well as being quite funny, it's actually also quite symbolic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. They called him 2 more times to HUAC, and the second time he went dressed as an international guerrilla, and he wore like a bandolero, very crazy looking. And I went as a witch, and I hexed HUAC, because how can you have a witch hunt without a witch?
Here is a sidebar about the House Committee of Un-American Activities, HUAC, as it comes up so often in this and some other stories. During the 30s and 40s, the American Communist Party grew into a significant, if relatively small, political force in the United States. Founded in 1919 in the wake of the Russian Revolution, the party attracted trade unionists, intellectuals, artists, civil rights campaigners, and anti-fascists. Although its membership never exceeded about 80,000, its influence extended well beyond its numbers through labour organisation, cultural movements, campaigns against racial segregation. But the party's ties to the Soviet Union, however, made it increasingly controversial. And of course, the onset of the Cold War transformed communism from a minority political movement into a perceived national security threat. And the House Committee of Un-American Activities, HUAC, established in 1945, became the most visible instrument of this campaign, investigating alleged communist infiltration of government, universities, trade unions, and, most famously, the entertainment industry. Witnesses were summoned to testify about their own political beliefs and identify others who'd been members of sympathisers of the Communist Party. Those who refused to cooperate often faced contempt of Congress charges, imprisonment, dismissal from their jobs, and effective blacklisting. In 1947, 10 writers and directors, later known as the Hollywood 10, refused to answer questions about their political affiliations. They were jailed and blacklisted, beginning a period in which hundreds of actors, writers, musicians and filmmakers found themselves unable to work. While HUAC uncovered some genuine Communist Party members and Soviet agents, critics argued that its methods encouraged guilt by association, infringed civil liberties, and created a climate of fear. The anti-communist atmosphere reached its peak during the early 50s, overlapping with the rise of Senator Joseph McCarthy, whose aggressive allegations of communist infiltration gave rise to the term McCarthyism. By the late 1950s and 60s, public opinion began to turn. HUAC's influence steadily declined before the committee was abolished in 1975. While the Soviet Union did maintain espionage networks within the US, sweeping investigations and blacklists of the Cold War demonstrated how fear of subversion can undermine freedom of expression.
Did the hex work, though?
It worked temporarily. The third time it was Christmas, and Jerry was called again. And this time he went as Santa Claus, but then the indictments came down, so it didn't fully work.
That way of thinking, that way of making a spectacle, absurdism you could call it, right, in a way, was quite effective, wasn't it? Because in a way, maybe the most famous thing that the Yippies activist event that they organised was attempting to levitate the Pentagon, right? Tell us about that. Tell us how that idea came up and actually what it was actually like.
People on the Lower East Side had been thinking about that before we even came along. Ed Sanders of the rock band The Fugs discovered that the Pentagon was an evil symbol during some Baroque period of history or something. And he had this idea that we should do an exorcism of the evil spirits and, cause the Pentagon to levitate. So we planned that as part of our protest in 1967. People chanted, and the idea was to encircle the entire Pentagon. But the thing is, there were a couple thousand of us, and they weren't going to let us encircle the Pentagon. A few people actually got in, and then they were either arrested or ejected. I can't remember now, but I think Ginsburg probably was there. And we always say the Pentagon did levitate, for sure, but it only got so far off the ground, not high enough. So we have a lot of work to do.
I know it's magical thinking, but it seems preposterous. At the same time, you can kind of imagine that in the ferment of the 60s and with people's experience, say psychedelic experiences, and also belief that you really could change the world, it's not that outlandish in a way, isn't it? It did levitate, right, by a millimetre or whatever, but say it levitated by a metre. People would have been, yeah, well, it's the 60s, right?
Yeah.
Most people would think, okay, that's not going to happen. But you do wonder whether a couple of them were sort of slightly worried that it might happen, These are people, after all, who've been practicing the black arts of psi power themselves, right? Attempting to use occult and mysterious methods to change the world themselves. So you never know, right?
Yeah, I think when Abbie said we're going to put LSD in the water in 1968 at the Democratic Convention, I think people believed that. For sure.
Right.
And there was no real plan.
Quite interesting about the protest at the Democrat Convention, because we tend to associate counterculture and progressives with the Democratic Party, whereas in fact, of course, really, the truth of it is that neither of the American political parties, and they're not really progressive in a radical sense, are they?
Not unless you hold their feet to the fire. Not yet.
Let's talk about some of the other things that the Yippies did.
We ran a pig for president. His name is Pegasus. We got him at a farm in Illinois. We brought him to a press conference downtown Chicago. He was arrested by the police. and we don't know what became of him.
No.
I think someone put oil on him, and so I think he probably got away.
So slippy.
Yeah, I think he probably slipped out of their grip. When Johnson was elected, the slogan was part of the way with LBJ. That was for people like me who didn't really like him, but we'll vote for him because, this time we said, why have half a hog when you can have the whole hog?
Very good. Did the mainstream press, obviously gain a lot of attention because it's a funny story, right? Did they also sort of take the Yippies seriously? How did you sort of balance the joy of the prank with the gravity of actually trying to stop this, horrendous conflict in Vietnam?
The media, like other people, were made up of lots of different elements. But I think actually they were pretty taken with the Yippies. It gave them a lot of things to write about, and pictures. And some of them befriended us. I mean, especially after collectively we were on trial for 10 months. The media were with us every day,
Let's talk about the trial. This is also, I think, a very significant countercultural moment, isn't it? Give us the background to it and tell us what happened.
8 guys were indicted. 2 of them were Yippies, 2 from the National Mobilization to end the war in Vietnam, and then 2 others who were activists in other parts of the country, and then Bobby Seale from the Black Panther Party, who was ridiculous that he was indicted. He was only there for a few hours in Chicago. He gave one little speech in Lincoln Park. And, but, they were going after the Panthers already all over the place.
What was the offense that they were alleged to have committed?
Conspiracy to cross state lines to incite riot. And really, although, I'm not always opposed to riots, because sometimes they're effective, but this was a police riot in Chicago. I mean, it did happen that many people kind of fought back, but it was totally initiated by the police. So conspiracy to cross state lines to incite riot, because we organized for people to come to Chicago, basically. When the trial happened, Bobby Seale and Jerry were both in jail because they were serving other sentences. Jerry was brought across country in a car with a guy who was shackled to him and wanted to escape. Then Jerry got out, and Bobby was still in. The whole time he was there, Bobby was in jail. He came to court, and every night he'd go back. He came to court in the very beginning, and he said to the judge that his lawyer couldn't be there, and he wanted a postponement. And it was very much within the judge's purview to give him that, but the judge refused to give him that. The judge insisted that he take one of the other lawyers, and he said, no, I'm not doing that. They're not my lawyers. He said, I'll defend myself. And the judge wouldn't let him. Then he started standing up and saying, I demand that I get my constitutional rights, and I demand to defend myself. The judge, over a period of, I think it was a couple weeks, they would bring Bobby in from the hold. At first just had something across his mouth and tied in the back so he couldn't talk. But then he would talk through it. By the end, he was in a chair, bound by his feet and his hands. A journalist once said he looked like a slave in a courtroom.
These days, you would say the optics of it are terrible, aren't they? Because you're saying this is an American court, post-civil rights movement. You've got basically a black man tied up in a chair. It doesn't look good,
doesn't
right?
look good.
No, and don't think that was a deliberate thing on the part of those indicted, but it actually massively backfired, didn't it? Because that image itself motivated a lot of people.
I would say Bobby's courage and persistence is the thing that won the day, made it backfire. He wasn't going to be a slave in the courtroom.
Because suddenly all these other people, journalists and writers, the Norman Mailer, I think, didn't they? They suddenly start to get interested.
Mailer was always interested. It put the trial on the national stage, what Bobby did. He didn't do it for a performative reason. He did it for real. It wasn't an act or anything. And
in a way, this trial, it was a bit like the mainstream establishment takes on the counterculture. It had a kind of symbolic resonance much greater than just 8 people on trial for allegedly doing something.
I mean, the lines were out the door of the whole 10 months, to get into the trial and to see it and stuff. When Jerry got out of being in that lockup, because he was only in it in the beginning, they had cut his hair. He had his long hair by then, and they cut his hair. And we wrote an article for the Underground newspaper asking people to send us locks of hair, either for Jerry or the judge, I think it was. And then people around the country sent locks of hair. And when he was in the lockup, just to cheer him up, we would give him these letters, and he would open them, and you see all the hair on the table in front of the judge. It was quite jolly at the same time.
There's a great image of you with a banner reading, "We are all outlaws in the eyes of America," at the trial. Something I wanted to ask you, which is, this is a progressive movement, right? It's a radical movement, but it was very heavily male-dominated, right? The counterculture in many, many ways was progressive, but in other ways it was quite traditional, wasn't it? So you already mentioned it, that, Jerry goes off to New York, you're back home sorting out your flat and packing all your stuff up. I think you told me before that, because I asked you about how did you sort of survive economically, and you said, well, I worked, This is also a time when, one of the things that's gone on in the counterculture was was feminism, right? Women's agencies, right? So how did you interact with that?
So it was a very traditional relationship, and it even had some more negative parts that I won't explain here. I mean, in terms of how Jerry behaved to me. He wasn't physically abusive, but he could be psychologically abusive to me. But there was a woman who was a Yippie named Robin Morgan, who turned out to be a leader of the feminist movement and still is very well known. A bunch of women took over one of the main underground newspapers in New York, which was called The Rat, and they published an all-women's issue, and she wrote a piece called Goodbye to All That, which was aimed at every part of the left and named names and called out all the male chauvinist behavior, all the different parts of the movement were exhibiting. At the end of the piece, she had said, "Free Kathleen Cleaver," who was the wife of Alfred Cleaver, "Free Judy Gumbo," who's my friend Stu's girlfriend. And she said, "Free Nancy KURSHAN." But she also said, "Free Robin Morgan," because she had been in a relationship with a man. And when she issued that and it came out publicly, I was incredibly uncomfortable. I was angry. I was angry at her. I was angry at me for being in the relationship that I was in, because I already knew that what she was saying was true. It's like you don't turn into a feminist overnight, or you don't recognize everything that's going on in a flash. It sometimes takes an evolution. And for me, that's kind of what happened. But that shook me. And I was mad at her. I was mad at Jerry. I was mad at me. It made me really think about it. And it reverberated for me for a long time. It took me a little while, but eventually I did leave him.
Well, before that, though, you did something quite radical, I think, as well. You travelled to North Vietnam as part of an all-women's delegation, right?
Yeah.
The amazing thing about that is that effectively North Vietnam was America's enemy. That's who the Americans were fighting. So effectively, you're going to meet with the enemy, which I'm sure, I imagine on the right in America would be regarded as being treacherous.
Yeah. I think that a lot of us were alienated, both by the war and everything else. Gloria Steinem might have said, alienation is when your government is at war and you're hoping for the other side to win. The reason I got to go to Vietnam, and it was an all-women's trip, is because the defendants were all in jail while they were waiting for an appeal. There was a peace conference in Stockholm, and they invited the Conspiracy 8 to come. They couldn't come, so Judy Gumbo and I went, and we asked this woman, Jean Plamondon, from the White Panther Party, if she would want to come with us. In Stockholm, we met the Vietnamese, and we got along really well. And we proposed to them that we organize a conference of poets, artists, musicians, painters, writers, countercultural people, maybe 50 of them, and we have it somewhere, not in the United States and not in Vietnam. And they agreed to that, but they said, but come to Vietnam first and visit with us, and we'll talk more about it. So we went to Vietnam. As I recall, by the way, Arlo Guthrie and Judy Collins gave us some money to go, which was very nice. And we invited Jane Fonda. She did go, not with us, but later.
Tell us about what it was like there and what your experiences were.
We spent 2 weeks in Vietnam. We spent a lot of time in Hanoi, the capital of the North. We didn't go to South Vietnam, where the war was in full range. The U.S. was bombing the two southernmost provinces of North Vietnam when we were there. And we asked to go there so we could, say we saw it with our own eyes. But the Vietnamese said, no, you're more valuable back home trying to end the war than dead here. Well, we met with women's groups all over. We went because they had a women's union. We met also with the musicians union. We went to museums. There's 60 minority peoples in Vietnam, and we went to visit one of them called the Thai Noir, which in French is black Thai. They lived in the mountains, so we went on 2 ferries, ferry that fit us and also a water buffalo, and also a musician on this beautiful instrument. And then we went on this tiny little ferry where we were just hunched over, the three of us. And we finally got to this mountain place, and all the houses were on stilts. We were greeted by the elders, and nobody had seen anybody who looked like us except they once saw a couple of Russian journalists who had been through there. It was quite an experience. And it's interesting because some of the minorities in Vietnam were apparently helpful to the U.S. side. I didn't meet any of those. But these people clearly were not.
So that must have really ramped up your anti-war sentiment, right? Because it's not something which is abstract and out there and a statistical thing. You've actually seen, met, communicated with, lived with the people who are being affected by it, and that makes a big difference, doesn't it?
Yeah, you start thinking about them more like you think about your own family.
The thing about the Vietnam War is it did end. There's lots of reasons why it ended, but I think without any doubt the counterculture galvanized a more wider opposition to it, which in the end sort of like brought it down. And the counterculture itself sort of started to change, didn't it? The anti-war movement maybe was losing its bearings in a sense, but you then split with Jerry, right? And, move away from Yippies into the next stage of your life. What was that like, breaking up with this person that you'd been not only romantically involved with, but so passionately involved with in terms of social action? And, you're kind of basically living in each other's heads, right?
Yeah. I left suddenly. It wasn't the nicest thing I've ever done. I didn't know how I would unentangle myself from him. And I couldn't envision myself staying in that city, even in New York, and building a new life there because everything was related to him that I was a part of. And I didn't think it wasn't going to be a friendship between us. He wasn't going to have that.
Because he didn't want you to leave, right?
Right. He didn't want me to leave. In fact, yesterday I was at a book group talking about my book, and a woman there said, I was at my friend's house after you broke up with Jerry, and he was crying hysterically about this woman who had left him. And she said it was you. I said, oh, wow. Okay. Too much information. After telling you I didn't do two relationships at the same time, met Howie, an old lover of mine, in Cleveland. He was close to Weatherman, and I was also already interested in Weatherman. But
this is the Weather Underground, right?
Weather Underground. I went to Ohio, and he and I decided that the Weather Underground was underground, and we couldn't find them, and he had been in jail and couldn't find them either. We were both in the same situation. So we moved to Kent, Ohio, where the 4 students had been killed the year before, because that's where he had been. He had been in school there, and he had been part of the movement there. And we organized there for a year, and he had a lot of friends there. We knew that people there would be fearful after they had killed the 4 students. So we tried to organize anti-war stuff. We ran an underground newspaper of our own called Dragonfire. Ho Chi Minh said, when the prison gates are open, the real dragon will fly out. And we liked the idea of Dragonfire. So
you get a new love affair, your love affair with political actions carrying on. And then, you become a kind of public face, don't you, in a way, a public member of the Weather Underground, which had been this militant organisation. Quite a different feeling, I'm guessing, than the sort of carnivalesque street theatre of the Yippies. Slightly darker.
Yeah, it was darker, but the thing is they were changing. So I joined after they issued this thing called New Morning, which was sort of an embrace of the counterculture, a criticism of their earlier ultra-militarism. So they were changing. Howie, who turned into my first husband, he and I called ourselves the Weather Yippies when we were in, and there was a big youth community in Kent that was also supportive.
It never goes away, but the kind of counterculture of those kind of 60s and 70s was starting to kind of change, wasn't it? And you become a mum as well. You don't stop though, do you? The interesting thing about you, Nancy, is that your sort of engagement with the more famous groups stops and you move on, but you spent 15 years subsequently battling, for prison reform, didn't you? This drive that you have moved from maybe what was more political things to maybe more social issues, right?
I consider prison political and social. The motivating factor is anti-racism, and it's been the thread all through, I'd say. I realized what the prisons were about. I didn't know anything about prisons. I had been arrested a few times for nonviolent civil disobedience. The only time I spent any time was that night in jail for spray painting. I subsequently learned from visiting Black people and corresponding with Black people who were involved in the movement and were my peers in age, what prisons were like. When I learned what prisons were like, it was just overwhelmingly obvious that that was a place that people should be trying to change. But people thought we were crazy back then. I mean, nobody was talking about prisons. White people weren't talking about prisons.
Well, this phrase, the prison industrial complex, is kind of quite widely used now, isn't it? But the phrase that you started to use, I mean, it's mind-boggling. The American mass incarceration, I mean, the number of people, and predominantly Black people, who are incarcerated in the States is astonishing, isn't it?
Yeah. So we specifically concentrated on sort of the most awful aspect of it. I mean, I guess you could say the death penalty is the most awful, but it's a close call between that and spending your whole life in prison, right? And then on top of that, being in solitary confinement 23 hours a day, 7 days a week, 356 days a year. That would drive me mad if I had to do that for any length of time. And yet people were in there indefinitely like that. But the thing is, all that was developing in that era. Like mass incarceration was skyrocketing. I wrote another book called Out of Control, a 15-year battle against control unit prisons, in which I did talk about those 15 years and what we found inside and what we did about it. And in that time, you know, I could say that was a failure because when we started, there was only one prison in the United States, long-term solitary, and that was Marion Federal Penitentiary in downstate Illinois. By the time my 15 years ended working on it, there was what we called a control unit prison in every state in the union. It just got worse and worse, really. By the time my book came out about it, there were many more people in the United States who were aware of prison, and that's true of today. I feel like there's, you know, documentaries made and people write books, you know, and that broke open the floodgates. So I think a lot of people are much more aware now of the crisis in criminal justice in this country. And then, of course, there's Black Lives Matter and the police murders, which are something else those were always happening and are still happening.
You also wrote about women imprisonment in the US, didn't you? You know, systemic violence against incarcerated women. Nancy, then you went on and spent 2 decades working as a social worker in Chicago public schools, right? At the same time, right? And you're a mum.
Yeah.
And it's quite interesting with the Yippies because we talked about some of the theatrical stuff, but they were also invested in, you know, creating alternative institutions, food co-ops, free clinics, underground newspapers. You know, there was a lot of experiments, a lot of social experiments that went on in the counterculture. And of those things, which do you think really did make a difference? Which parts of the counterculture genuinely did change America?
They all played off of each other. The women's movement and the gay movement, did they come out of the political movement or the counterculture or both? Those have been great developments.
In terms of where we are now, the environmental movement.
That too. Well, that I would say when I got into the more political spaces, people didn't really think that was a serious issue. Counterculture never pinpointed it as climate change or anything. It was like more like a love of nature, right? And appreciation for the natural world and seeing us as all connected, that kind of thing.
The ecology movement, as the effects of climate change have become more apparent over the years, has become much more the environmental movement, you know, with world of protest.
Of course, yeah. That's where I am right now, actually.
Looking back over your life, radical politics in the counterculture, what experiences have changed you most, do you think? Not just politically, but personally.
Different things at different times. I mean, there are so many pivotal moments, even though it all seems like it's the same. I mean, I've been protesting my whole life. There are moments when I've just suddenly began to change or see things differently, I guess. I was sent to Israel by my family in college to live on a kibbutz because my uncle lived there, because he had been blacklisted in the United States. Seeing what Israel was like way back then made me realize that there was a problem there, that I couldn't embrace it in the way that I had thought I would be able to. I went back to Vietnam in 2013 as an invited guest of the Vietnamese, along with other people who were in the anti-war. And I realized at that time that we had made a difference. I think I always thought that we did, but I wasn't quite sure, because living in the United States, we are indoctrinated and with the current thinking. And I think I always doubted, did I waste my time or didn't I? But they were so thankful to what the anti-war movement had done. And then I realized how unusual it is to have an anti-war movement that makes that kind of a difference. Maybe that gave me hope to keep going.
Did you stay in contact with, or did you remake contact with Jerry?
I tried to a little bit, but we never really did. He said to me, "Oh, you're just doing the same old thing you were always doing. You don't change." He and Abbie had this thing where they did a Yippie tour and they debated each other. Maybe they were doing it because Abbie needed money and they did get paid for these things. I didn't wish him ill in any way, and I never thought he was a traitor, and I'm sure he still had good values, but we never became friends. But I've been friends with almost everybody else. I was friends with Anita until I was with her the last week that she died. My friend Judy Gumbo, I stayed friends with here. But, a lot of the people are gone.
Rubin went on to become very rich, didn't he, actually, in the end? And sort of.
But he was dabbling, yes, in Wall Street, apparently. And also he had this social networking thing going on.
You're still at it, Nancy.
Yeah.
You started early in life and, you've not stopped, basically. You're still going to protests. You're still organising. You're still doing what you can, right? That drive, whether it's a choice or an inevitability or fate or destiny, still operating, isn't it?
I can't imagine not. I'm just frustrated that I'm 82 years old and there's only so much I can do. I would love to do more than I do, because I feel like we are at this pivotal moment, and it's not clear which way it's going to go. And it needs to go more forward. It doesn't need to go back to where we were. It needs to have more of a vision. But, this week, 3 Democratic Socialists won in New York City. It's like the best of times and the worst of times, right? And we have to turn it into the best of times. And that doesn't mean you have to do the kind of protesting that I do even. I mean, I just think people have to do whatever they can to talk about and act for building a better world for all of us and all the flora and fauna of the planet.
Keep protesting.
Thank you.
So, Nancy KURSHAN, Yippie, weather undergrounder, prison reformer. Thanks very much for coming to the Bureau of Lost Culture.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. You are an inspiration. It was a great pleasure to spend some time. Listeners, we got into a lot of other stuff I didn't have time to include, like how many of the significant countercultural, radical and theatrical American figures were Jewish, how radical the kibbutz system was, and how much things have changed in Israel. Nancy's a very good example of the women who were movers and shakers but were eclipsed publicly by their men and other celebrity countercultural figures. The piece that she mentioned, Goodbye to All That polemic railing against all that by Robin Morgan, I'll put it in the show notes. It's quite something. I'll also put a link to Nancy's book, Levitating the Pentagon, and her book about prison injustice out of control. Terrific stuff. Thank you for listening. Let's keep listening. Join us, support us if you can, Bureau of Lost Culture. And I will see you down the road, over the hillsides, and round the bend for more of these tales from the underground.
We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome. Some I do believe we shall overcome someday. We'll walk hand in hand. We'll walk hand in hand. We'll walk hand in hand someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I